The autumn rain had turned to sleet by the time Eleanor Hartwell turned 19. She stood at the tall window of her family's drawing room, watching the gray afternoon dissolve into something colder, something that promised winter's early arrival. The glass was cold against her fingertips, and beyond it, the manicured gardens her mother once prided herself on had grown wild and unkempt. The roses were gone. The fountain had run dry. Everything beautiful had withered, just like her family's fortune. Behind her, she could hear her father's labored breathing. He sat hunched in his leather chair, the one piece of furniture they hadn't yet sold. His hands trembled as he held a crystal glass, also one of the last remaining, filled with whiskey he could no longer afford. The smell of it mixed with the mustiness of the room, of curtains that hadn't been cleaned in months, of a house slowly dying. "Eleanor," he said, his voice cracked and hollow. "Come sit down. We need to discuss your future." She closed her eyes briefly before turning. She had known this conversation was coming. For weeks, creditors had appeared at their door with increasing frequency. The servants had left one by one, their wages unpaid. Her mother spent most days in her bedroom, crying into handkerchiefs that were no longer properly laundered. The Hartwell name, once respected throughout upstate New York, had become synonymous with scandal and ruin. Eleanor crossed the room, her simple gray dress rustling softly. It was one of 3 she still owned. The rest had been sold, along with her jewelry, her books, her piano. She sat across from her father, folding her hands in her lap with a composure that belied the storm of anxiety in her chest. "There is a gentleman," her father began, unable to meet her eyes. "A man of considerable wealth and standing. He has made an offer." Eleanor's stomach tightened. She had heard rumors, whispers from the last remaining housemaid before she too had departed. Whispers of her father's desperation, of meetings held in secret, of a transaction being arranged. But hearing it spoken aloud made it terrifyingly real. "What kind of offer?" she asked, though she already knew. Her father finally looked at her, and she saw shame burning in his bloodshot eyes. "He will clear all our debts, every single one. Your mother and I will be able to keep the house, modest as our circumstances will be. Your younger sisters will have dowries when they come of age. In exchange for what?" Eleanor's voice was steady, but her hands had begun to tremble in her lap. "In exchange for your hand in marriage." The words hung in the air like smoke. Eleanor felt the room tilt slightly, as if the floor had become unsteady beneath her. She had expected this, yes, but the reality of it was so much heavier than the anticipation. "Who is he?" she whispered. "The Duke of Ashford." Eleanor's breath caught. Even she, sheltered as she had been, knew that name. Everyone in New York society knew that name, though few had ever seen the man himself. He was a figure of dark legend, a wealthy landowner who had arrived from England years ago and purchased a massive estate in the most remote part of the Hudson Valley. He never attended social functions. He never accepted invitations. His business dealings were conducted through intermediaries, and the few who had met him spoke of his coldness, his calculating nature, his complete lack of warmth or charm. Some said his wife had died under mysterious circumstances. Others claimed he had driven her to madness. All agreed on one thing: the Duke of Ashford was not a man to be trifled with, and he was certainly not a man who inspired dreams of happy matrimony. "Father, no," Eleanor said, her composure finally cracking. "You cannot mean this. The Duke is he's our only option." Her father interrupted, his voice rising with desperate anger. "Do you think I would choose this if there was any other way? We are ruined, Eleanor. Ruined. The creditors will take everything. We'll be thrown into the streets. Your mother's health cannot withstand such a shock. Your sisters will have nothing. No prospects. No future. Is that what you want?" Eleanor felt tears burning behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had not cried once during these terrible months, and she would not start now. Instead, she thought of her mother, frail and heartbroken, of her 2 younger sisters, only 14 and 12, who still played with their dolls, unaware of how close they stood to total destitution. "When?" she asked quietly. Her father sagged with relief so profound it was almost painful to witness. "The ceremony is arranged for 3 days hence. He has insisted on efficiency. The Duke is not a man who tolerates delays." 3 days. Eleanor had 3 days left of being herself, of being free, before she became the property of a man she had never met, a man whose very name inspired fear and revulsion. The wedding took place on a Thursday afternoon, under skies so gray they seemed to press down on the earth itself. The ceremony was held in the small chapel on the Hartwell property, attended only by Eleanor's immediate family and 2 witnesses provided by the Duke, stern-faced men in expensive suits who said nothing and watched everything. The Duke himself arrived exactly on time, stepping from a black carriage pulled by 4 magnificent horses. Eleanor watched from an upstairs window as he emerged, and her first thought was that he looked like winter personified. He was tall, over 6 feet, with broad shoulders that filled his perfectly tailored black coat. His hair was dark, almost black, though she could see strands of silver at his temples. He moved with the confidence of a man who had never been refused anything, his steps measured and precise, but it was his face that made her breath catch, not from admiration, but from a kind of fearful fascination. He was handsome in the way a storm is beautiful, compelling, dangerous, impossible to look away from. His features were sharp and aristocratic, His jawline strong, his nose straight and prominent, but his eyes, even from a distance, she could see they were a pale, icy blue, the color of a winter sky just before a blizzard. They were the eyes of a man who felt nothing, or who had trained himself to feel nothing. He glanced up at her window, and for one terrible moment their eyes met. Eleanor stepped back instinctively, her heart hammering. She had the distinct impression that he had seen everything about her in that single glance, had assessed her worth and found it adequate perhaps, but nothing more. "Eleanor, darling, it's time." Her mother's voice came from the doorway, thick with suppressed tears. The ceremony itself was mercifully brief. Eleanor stood beside the Duke in the cold chapel, painfully aware of how much taller he was, how his presence seemed to fill the entire space. He did not look at her during the vows. His responses were delivered in a deep, cultured voice that held no emotion whatsoever. When the priest instructed him to place the ring on her finger, his hands were steady and cold as they briefly touched hers. The ring itself was extraordinary. A large sapphire surrounded by diamonds, clearly worth more than everything her family had ever owned combined. It felt heavy on her finger, like a shackle made of precious metal and stone. "You may kiss the bride," the priest said tentatively. The Duke turned to her and for the first time truly looked at her. His pale eyes moved over her face with the detached interest of someone examining a purchase. Then with mechanical precision he leaned down and pressed his lips to hers in the briefest, coldest kiss imaginable. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds, conveyed nothing, and felt like being touched by marble. When he pulled away, he turned to her father. "The documents?" Her father, hands shaking, produced a folder of papers. The Duke's men examined them briefly, then nodded. One of them produced a bank draft, which he handed to her father with no ceremony. Just like that, the transaction was complete. Eleanor Hartwell's freedom had been purchased for the price of her family's debts. The journey to the Duke's estate began immediately after the ceremony. There was no wedding breakfast, no celebration, no opportunity for Eleanor to say a proper goodbye to her family. Her mother embraced her briefly, sobbing into her shoulder, while her father could not even meet her eyes. Her sisters clung to her, not fully understanding why Eleanor was leaving, but sensing something terrible was happening. "I'll write to you," Eleanor promised them, though the Duke's man had already taken her arm, gently but firmly guiding her toward the carriage. The Duke was already seated inside, reading a document by the dim afternoon light. He did not look up as Eleanor was helped into the carriage by one of his men. He did not acknowledge her presence at all as the carriage lurched into motion, carrying her away from everything she had ever known. Eleanor sat across from him, her hands folded tightly in her lap, watching the landscape roll past the window. The trees had mostly lost their leaves, standing like skeletal sentinels along the road. The sky was growing darker, and she noticed with a flutter of anxiety that snowflakes had begun to mix with the rain. They traveled in complete silence for over an hour. The Duke continued reading his papers, occasionally making notes with a fountain pen, as if he were alone in the carriage. Eleanor studied him covertly, trying to understand the man she had just bound her life to. His face in the close confines of the carriage was even more imposing than she had first thought. There was no softness in it anywhere, no hint of kindness or warmth. His jaw was set in a permanent expression of stern concentration. A small scar marked his left eyebrow, barely visible but suggesting a violent past. His hands, as they held the papers, were large and strong, the hands of a man who might have done manual labor once despite his aristocratic bearing. "You're staring," he said suddenly. Without looking up from his documents, Eleanor flushed. "Caught. I apologize, Your Grace. I was merely curious about the man you've been sold to." He finally looked up, and the full force of those icy blue eyes hit her like a physical blow. "That's understandable. Ask your questions. We have at least another 2 hours of travel." His directness was somehow more unsettling than his silence. Eleanor swallowed, trying to find her courage. "Why did you agree to this arrangement? You could have—" "There must be many women who would willingly marry me." A cold smile touched his lips, but it held no humor. "Yes, there are many women whose families would thrust them at a wealthy duke regardless of his reputation. That is precisely why I chose this method. You had no choice in this matter, Miss Hartwell." "Forgive me, Your Grace, the Duchess of Ashford now. You harbor no romantic illusions about me. You have no expectations of affection or companionship. This arrangement is honest in its dishonesty, if you will." Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "You speak as if this is preferable to a genuine connection." "Genuine connection is a fairy tale told to naive young girls," he replied, returning his attention to his papers. "I require a wife for certain social and legal purposes. You required financial salvation for your family. We have both received what we needed. That is the extent of our relationship. And if I—" Eleanor stopped, unsure how to even phrase the question. "If you what?" He looked at her again, one dark eyebrow raised. "Wish to be treated with basic human decency? You will be provided with comfortable quarters, anything you need or want within reason, and complete freedom to occupy yourself as you see fit within the boundaries of the estate. I will not mistreat you. I am not a monster, regardless of what you may have heard." "But you are cold," Eleanor said, the words escaping before she could stop them. Something flickered in his eyes, surprise perhaps that she had spoken so boldly. "Cold is safe, Your Grace. Cold does not disappoint. Cold does not break hearts or make promises it cannot keep. You will come to appreciate the value of coldness, I assure you." Before Eleanor could respond, the carriage hit a particularly rough patch of road, jostling them both. She grabbed the edge of her seat to steady herself and noticed that outside the window the snow was falling harder now, accumulating on the bare branches of trees. "We're heading into a storm," she observed. "Yes," the Duke replied, glancing out the window with no apparent concern. "The estate is another hour north. We'll arrive before it becomes too severe." But even as he spoke, the wind picked up, howling around the carriage. The horse's pace slowed as the road became increasingly difficult to navigate. Eleanor could see the driver hunched forward, struggling to see through the thickening curtain of snow. The Duke finally set aside his papers, his expression shifting to something closer to concern. He leaned forward and opened the small window to the driver's seat. "Matthews, how much further?" "Hard to say in this weather, Your Grace." The driver's voice came back, strained. "The road markers are already covered, but I believe we're close. Perhaps 30 minutes if the horses can manage." The Duke closed the window and settled back in his seat. For the first time, Eleanor saw tension in his shoulders, a tightness around his eyes. "We'll make it," he said, though it was unclear if he was reassuring her or himself. The last 30 minutes of the journey were harrowing. The wind screamed around them, rocking the carriage violently. The temperature had dropped precipitously, and Eleanor could feel the cold seeping through the walls despite the heavy blankets provided. The Duke sat silent and still, his eyes fixed on the window, watching the world disappear into white chaos. Then, finally, through the blizzard, Eleanor saw lights, warm, golden lights that grew steadily brighter as they approached. The carriage turned, wheels crunching through deepening snow, and there it was, Ashford Manor. It was enormous, a Gothic structure of dark stone that seemed to rise out of the earth itself. 3 stories tall, with towers at each corner, and countless windows glowing like eyes in the storm. It looked ancient, impossible, as if someone had transported a medieval English castle to the American wilderness. The carriage pulled under a covered portico, and immediately servants appeared, bundled against the cold, rushing to open the door and help them out. The Duke stepped down first, then turned to offer his hand to Eleanor. She took it, feeling again that coldness, that sense of touching something carved from ice rather than flesh. As her feet touched the ground, a gust of wind nearly knocked her over. The Duke's hand tightened on hers, steadying her, and for just a moment she felt the strength in his grip, the solidness of him. Then he released her and turned to his staff. "Close the gates," he ordered. "No one in or out until this storm passes. Secure all the windows and make sure the fires are burning in every room. It's going to be a long night." Eleanor stood shivering under the portico, watching servants scurry to follow his orders. The massive iron gates at the entrance to the estate were already swinging closed, and she had the sudden, terrible realization that she was now completely cut off from the outside world. No one could reach her here, and she could not leave. The Duke turned back to her, snowflakes catching in his dark hair. "Welcome to Ashford Manor, Your Grace. Come, you must be freezing." He led her through the heavy wooden doors into the entrance hall, and despite everything, her fear, her despair, her complete uncertainty about her future, Eleanor could not help but gasp at what she saw. The interior of the manor was breathtaking. The entrance hall rose 2 stories, with a grand staircase of dark wood sweeping upward. Enormous tapestries hung on the stone walls, and suits of armor stood sentinel in the alcoves. Chandeliers dripping with crystals cast warm light over everything, making the space feel both grand and strangely intimate. But it was also cold. Not physically, as fires burned in massive fireplaces at either end of the hall, but emotionally. There was no warmth here, no sense of home. It felt like a museum, beautiful but lifeless, meant to be admired but never truly inhabited. "Mrs. Crawford will show you to your quarters," the Duke said, and Eleanor turned to see an older woman in a severe black dress approaching. "You'll want to rest and change before dinner. We dine at 8. Will you?" Eleanor began, but he was already walking away, his footsteps echoing on the marble floor as he disappeared down a corridor. Mrs. Crawford came to stand beside her, her weathered face not unkind. "Come along, Your Grace. Let's get you settled. It's not as frightening as it seems, the manor. You'll get used to it." As Eleanor followed the housekeeper up the grand staircase, she looked back once at the doors they had entered through. Outside, the blizzard raged, sealing her inside this stone fortress with a man who spoke of coldness as if it were a virtue, who had purchased her like one might purchase a painting or a piece of furniture. The doors were closed now, locked against the storm, and Eleanor could not shake the feeling that she had just entered a prison made of stone and snow, beautiful and terrible, from which there might be no escape. Eleanor's quarters were located in the east wing of the manor, a suite of rooms so vast they could have housed her entire family with space to spare. Mrs. Crawford led her through a sitting room furnished with velvet sofas and mahogany tables, then into a bedroom dominated by a 4-poster bed draped in heavy burgundy curtains. Everything was immaculate, expensive, and utterly impersonal. The Duke had these rooms prepared when he learned of the wedding, Mrs. Crawford explained, moving to light additional lamps. The storm outside had darkened the afternoon to near twilight. He was quite specific about ensuring your comfort. Eleanor ran her hand along the back of a chair, feeling the rich fabric. How thoughtful of him to purchase comfort for his newest acquisition. Mrs. Crawford's eyes flickered with something, surprise perhaps, or approval. You have spirit, Your Grace. That's good. You'll need it here. She moved to the wardrobe and opened it, revealing an array of dresses in various styles and colors. The Duke commissioned an entire wardrobe for you. He employed 3 seamstresses working around the clock. I believe he estimated your measurements from, well, I'm not certain how, but if anything doesn't fit properly, we can have alterations made. Eleanor stared at the dresses. They were beautiful, far more beautiful than anything she had owned even before her family's ruin. Silks, satins, wool day dresses, evening gowns with intricate beading. It should have felt like a gift. Instead, it felt like being dressed for a role in a play she had never auditioned for. A bath has been drawn for you in the adjoining room, Mrs. Crawford continued, gesturing toward another door. I'll return in an hour to help you dress for dinner. His Grace prefers punctuality. Of course he does, Eleanor murmured. When Mrs. Crawford left, Eleanor stood alone in the center of the vast bedroom, listening to the wind howl against the windows. The storm had intensified, and she could hear the sharp crack of ice against glass. She moved to the window and looked out, but there was nothing to see. Just a wall of white, as if the entire world had been erased. She was completely isolated now. No family, no friends, no familiar faces. Just this cold stone fortress and the even colder man who owned it. The bathwater was still hot, scented with lavender oil. Eleanor sank into it gratefully, letting the warmth seep into her chilled bones. As she washed away the grime of travel, she tried to organize her thoughts to make sense of the impossible situation she found herself in. The Duke was not what she had expected. Oh, he was cold. That much was true. But there was something else beneath that icy exterior. Something she couldn't quite identify. The way his eyes had lingered on her for just a moment when he steadied her in the storm. The care he had taken to have rooms prepared, clothes commissioned. A man who felt nothing would not bother with such details. Or perhaps she was simply grasping at straws, trying to find humanity in a man who had openly admitted he viewed their marriage as nothing more than a business transaction. Dinner was served in a formal dining room that could have seated 40 guests, but tonight held only 2. The Duke sat at the head of an impossibly long table, and Eleanor was positioned to his right. Close enough for conversation, but far enough that the distance felt symbolic. He had changed from his travel clothes into evening attire, a black dinner jacket with a crisp white shirt that made his pale eyes seem even more striking. His dark hair was swept back from his face, revealing the sharp angles of his features. He looked like something from a painting, beautiful in a harsh, unapproachable way. Eleanor wore one of the new dresses, a deep green silk that Mrs. Crawford had assured her was appropriate for evening dining. The housekeeper had arranged her auburn hair in an elegant style, and for a moment, looking at herself in the mirror, Eleanor had almost felt like someone else, someone who belonged in a place like this. But now, sitting at this vast table with silver cutlery she wasn't entirely sure how to use properly, she felt like an imposter. The Duke had not looked at her when she entered. A footman had pulled out her chair and she had sat, and still the Duke remained focused on cutting his roasted pheasant with mechanical precision. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the clink of silverware and the howling of the wind outside. Eleanor took a small bite of her food, which was delicious, far better than anything her family's depleted kitchen had produced in months, but it tasted like ash in her mouth. Finally, unable to bear it any longer, she spoke. How long have you lived here, Your Grace? He looked up as if surprised she had the audacity to initiate conversation. 5 years. And before that? England, Northumberland, to be specific. Eleanor waited for him to elaborate. He didn't. She tried again. What made you leave England and come to America? That is not a topic I discuss. His tone was flat. Final. I see. Eleanor set down her fork, her appetite completely gone. And what topics are we permitted to discuss? Or shall we simply sit in silence for the rest of our lives? Something flashed in his eyes, anger or perhaps amusement. It was gone too quickly to tell. You may discuss whatever you like, Your Grace. I simply choose not to participate in conversations about my personal history. Then what shall we discuss? The weather? It's storming, in case you hadn't noticed. The food? It's excellent. Your manner? It's large and cold and feels more like a mausoleum than a home. Eleanor was surprised by her own boldness, by the anger rising in her chest. You purchased the right to call me your wife, Your Grace, but I retain the right to speak my mind. The Duke set down his own silverware with deliberate care. For a long moment he simply looked at her, those pale eyes assessing. Then, unexpectedly, one corner of his mouth lifted in something that might have been a smile, except it held no warmth. You're angry. I'm terrified, Eleanor corrected, but anger is easier to manage than fear. That's perceptive. He leaned back in his chair, studying her with new interest. Most people in your position would be attempting to ingratiate themselves to me, trying to make me like them. Would that work? No. Then why waste the effort? Eleanor met his gaze directly, refusing to look away first. You've made it quite clear that you have no interest in me as a person. I'm simply a requirement you've checked off a list, so let's at least be honest about what this is. The Duke was quiet for a moment, and Eleanor thought she had perhaps gone too far. Then he spoke, his voice thoughtful. You're right, this arrangement is not what most would call a marriage, but I did not lie to you in the carriage. You will be treated well here. You will want for nothing material, except freedom, except choice, except any hope of genuine human connection. Those are luxuries, Your Grace, and luxuries, as I'm sure your family's situation has taught you, are often the first casualties of survival. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes but refused to let them fall. That's a terribly sad way to view the world. Perhaps, but it's honest. He stood abruptly, signaling the end of the meal. If you'll excuse me, I have work to attend to in my study. Mrs. Crawford will show you to the library if you wish to read, or you may return to your quarters. The choice, in this small matter at least, is yours. He left without waiting for a response, his footsteps echoing through the vast dining room. Eleanor sat alone at the enormous table, surrounded by flickering candlelight and the howling storm, feeling more isolated than she had ever felt in her life. She couldn't sleep. After returning to her quarters and attempting to read by lamplight, Eleanor had finally given up and decided to explore the manor. It was past midnight now, and the household had gone quiet. Even the servants had retreated to their quarters, leaving only the night staff, and they were few and discreet. Wrapped in a thick dressing gown Mrs. Crawford had provided, Eleanor moved through the darkened corridors with a single candle to light her way. The manor was different at night, more alive somehow. Despite the absence of people, the shadows seemed deeper. The stone walls seemed to breathe. Every creak and groan of the old building made her heart jump. She found herself drawn to the west wing, the opposite direction from her own quarters. The Duke had disappeared in this direction after dinner, and she was curious about what lay in this part of the manor. What did a man like him consider private space? The corridor here was lined with portraits, stern-faced men and women in elaborate period clothing, all with those same pale blue eyes. The Duke's ancestors, presumably. Eleanor studied them as she passed, noting how none of them smiled. They all had that same cold, assessing expression she had seen on the Duke's face. At the end of the corridor, she found a door slightly ajar, warm light spilling from within. She knew she should turn back, return to her room, mind her own business. But curiosity, and perhaps a desperate need to understand the man she was now bound to, drove her forward. She pushed the door open carefully and found herself in a library that took her breath away. The room was circular, built into one of the manor's towers. Floor-to-ceiling shelves lined every wall, packed with thousands of books. A fire burned in an ornate fireplace, and deep leather chairs were positioned throughout the space. But what struck Eleanor most were the personal touches, things she hadn't seen anywhere else in the manor. A chess set mid-game on a side table, a violin resting on a stand near the window, papers scattered across a desk, covered in what looked like musical notation, and photographs. Several framed photographs on the mantelpiece. Eleanor moved closer, her curiosity overcoming her caution. The photographs showed a younger version of the Duke, his face less hard, his eyes holding something that might have been warmth. He stood beside a woman with dark hair and a gentle smile, her hand resting on his arm. In another photograph, the same woman held a baby. You shouldn't be here. Eleanor spun around, nearly dropping her candle. The Duke stood in the doorway, still fully dressed despite the late hour. His expression was impossible to read in the firelight. I apologize, Eleanor said quickly. I couldn't sleep, and I was exploring, and I saw the light. I don't sleep much either, he interrupted, moving into the room. He glanced at the photographs she had been examining, and something painful flickered across his face. That was my wife, Catherine, and our son, James. Eleanor's heart clenched. The woman in the photographs was no longer here, and neither, presumably, was the child. I'm so sorry for your loss. Are you? He moved to the fireplace, staring into the flames. Or are you simply saying what you believe is appropriate? I am genuinely sorry, Eleanor insisted. No one should have to endure the loss of— They died, he said abruptly, his voice harsh. 5 years ago, a fever took them both within a week. James was only 2 years old. The pain in his voice was raw, real, the first genuine emotion she had heard from him. Eleanor understood suddenly why he had built such high walls around himself, why he spoke of coldness as if it were a virtue. He wasn't cold by nature. He had made himself cold to survive an unbearable grief. That's why you left England, she said softly. You couldn't bear to stay where everything reminded you of them. I came to America because there was nothing left for me there, he replied, still not looking at her. I thought distance would help. I thought building this place, starting over, would help. But grief is portable, Your Grace. It follows you wherever you go. Eleanor moved closer, drawn by the vulnerability she was witnessing. Is that why you wanted this arrangement? Because you can't bear the thought of caring for someone again, of risking that kind of loss? He finally turned to look at her, and in the firelight his eyes weren't cold at all. They were filled with a deep, bottomless sadness. I wanted this arrangement because I am not capable of being the husband a woman deserves. I cannot give affection. I cannot give tenderness. I have nothing left inside me but ice and stone. But I could at least provide security, protection, a comfortable life. It seemed more honest than pretending I could offer something I couldn't. And what if, Eleanor said carefully, what if the woman didn't need you to be something you're not? What if she simply needed you to be honest with her, to treat her as an equal rather than a possession? He studied her for a long moment, and Eleanor saw something shift in his expression. Not warmth, not yet, but perhaps the first crack in his armor. You're not what I expected. Neither are you, Eleanor replied. A gust of wind rattled the windows violently, making them both turn. The storm had reached a fever pitch, and through the glass, Eleanor could see nothing but swirling white chaos. The howling was so loud it seemed to shake the very foundations of the manor. This is going to be a bad one, the Duke said, moving to check the window latches. We might be snowed in for days. Days? Eleanor felt a flutter of panic. The idea of being trapped here, with him with no possibility of escape, was overwhelming. He must have seen the fear in her face because his expression softened slightly. You're safe here, Your Grace. The manor has weathered worse storms, and I meant what I said. I will not harm you. I know, Eleanor said, surprised to find that she believed him. I'm not afraid of you. I'm afraid of everything else. Of this life, of losing myself completely. The Duke was quiet for a moment, then he did something unexpected. He moved to a cabinet and retrieved a bottle of amber liquid and 2 glasses. Brandy? Eleanor hesitated and nodded. He poured 2 generous measures and handed her one. Their fingers brushed briefly in the exchange, and she was struck again by how cold his hands were, as if no amount of fire could warm them. To honesty, he said, raising his glass, since that seems to be the only currency we have between us. To honesty, Eleanor echoed, and they drank. The brandy burned going down, but it left a pleasant warmth in its wake. Eleanor felt some of her tension ease, and she moved to sit in one of the leather chairs near the fire. After a moment's hesitation, the Duke sat across from her. Tell me about your family, he said, not about the debts or the scandal. Tell me who they are. Eleanor was surprised by the question. By his interest, she spoke about her mother's love of gardening, her father's former kindness before gambling had consumed him, her sister's dreams and fears. The Duke listened without interrupting, his pale eyes fixed on her face. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. They will be cared for, he said finally. I gave your father enough to clear his debts, but I've also established a trust for your sisters. They will have proper dowries when they come of age. Your parents will never want for anything. Eleanor felt tears spring to her eyes. Why would you do that? That wasn't part of the arrangement. Because you care about them, he said simply, and because ensuring their welfare ensures yours. You'll rest easier knowing they're provided for. That's more kindness than I expected. It's not kindness, it's practicality. But something in his voice suggested otherwise. They sat together in companionable silence for a while, listening to the storm rage outside and the fire crackle within. Eleanor studied him covertly over the rim of her glass. In this softer light, with his guard slightly lowered, she could see traces of the man he must have been before grief had carved away everything soft. She could see why Catherine had loved him. The violin, Eleanor said, gesturing to the instrument. Do you play? I used to. Not anymore. Why not? Because music requires feeling, and feeling is dangerous. Eleanor set down her glass and stood moving to the violin. She picked it up carefully, feeling the weight of it, the craftsmanship. My mother taught me when I was young. I wasn't very good, but I loved it. You sold your violin, the Duke said. It wasn't a question. Yes. It was one of the first things to go. He stood as well, moving closer. Play something, if you remember how. Eleanor looked at him in surprise. Now? It's the middle of the night. No one will complain. And I find I'm curious. There was something in his voice, something almost vulnerable. Eleanor lifted the violin to her shoulder, adjusted the bow, and began to play. The melody that came out was simple, a folk song her mother had taught her years ago. She was rusty, hitting wrong notes and struggling with the fingering, but she played from memory and heart. When she finished, she lowered the instrument and looked at the Duke. He was staring at her with an expression she couldn't read, something between pain and wonder. Catherine used to play that song, he said quietly. She would play it for James before bed. I'm sorry, I didn't know. He held up a hand. Don't apologize. It's been 5 years since I heard music in this house. I'd forgotten how it could make a place feel less empty. He took the violin from her hands, his fingers brushing hers again. This time the touch lingered for just a moment longer than necessary. You should return to your quarters, he said, his voice rough. It's late, and tomorrow will be long. The storm will likely keep us confined indoors. Eleanor nodded, recognizing a dismissal when she heard one, but as she moved toward the door, she paused. Your Grace, thank you for telling me about Catherine and James. I know it wasn't easy. He turned to look at her, his expression guarded again. I don't know why I told you. I haven't spoken their names aloud in years. Perhaps, Eleanor said gently, because you're tired of carrying that grief alone. She left before he could respond, making her way back through the darkened corridors to her own quarters. But as she climbed into the enormous bed, she found that her fear had diminished slightly. The Duke was not the monster she had imagined. He was simply a man who had loved deeply and lost everything, and who had built walls so high around his heart that he couldn't find his way out anymore. And somehow, impossibly, Eleanor found herself wanting to help him find that way. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the manor, but inside, wrapped in blankets and watching shadows dance on the ceiling, Eleanor felt the first stirrings of something she couldn't quite name. Not hope, exactly. That seemed too dangerous. But perhaps possibility. The Duke had shown her his grief tonight, had let her see past his carefully constructed coldness, and in doing so, he had revealed that beneath the ice there was still a heart beating, still a man capable of feeling, even if he had convinced himself otherwise. As Eleanor finally drifted toward sleep, her last thought was of his hands brushing against hers, and how even in that brief contact she had felt something electric, something that suggested the ice around him might not be as impenetrable as he believed. The storm would rage for days, trapping them together in this stone fortress. And in that forced proximity, Eleanor suspected, the carefully maintained distance between them would become increasingly difficult to preserve. The second day of the storm dawned gray and relentless. Eleanor woke to find her windows completely obscured by snow and ice, transforming her room into a strange cocoon of muffled silence. The howling wind had not abated. If anything, it had grown stronger overnight, rattling the ancient stones of the manor as if testing their resolve. She dressed with Mrs. Crawford's assistance, choosing a deep burgundy day dress from the seemingly endless wardrobe the Duke had provided. As the housekeeper arranged her hair, Eleanor caught her own reflection in the mirror and was struck by how different she looked. Not just the expensive clothing or the elegant styling, but something in her eyes, a determination that hadn't been there before. "His Grace has requested your presence for breakfast," Mrs. Crawford said, fastening the last pin in Eleanor's hair. "In the morning room, not the formal dining hall. He thought it might be more comfortable." Eleanor felt her pulse quicken. After their conversation last night in the library, something had shifted between them. The Duke had shown her a glimpse of the man beneath the ice, and she found herself oddly eager to see him again. The morning room was smaller and infinitely warmer than the formal dining hall. Large windows, now sheets of white from the accumulated snow, would normally have offered views of the grounds. A fire crackled cheerfully in the hearth, and the table was set for two, positioned close together rather than at opposite ends. The Duke was already there, standing by the windows with a cup of coffee in his hand. He wore dark trousers and a charcoal waistcoat, his white shirt open at the collar in a way that seemed almost casual. It was the most relaxed she had seen him. He turned when she entered, and for just a moment she saw something in his expression. Appreciation, perhaps, or simple acknowledgement of her presence. "Good morning, Your Grace," he said, moving to pull out her chair himself rather than waiting for a servant to do it. "I trust you slept well despite the storm." "As well as could be expected in a strange place," Eleanor replied, settling into her seat. "And you?" "I rarely sleep well." He took his own seat across from her, close enough now that she could see the fine lines around his eyes, evidence of sleepless nights and carried burdens. "But I was productive. I've been reviewing the household accounts and planning for the extended isolation. We have provisions for at least 2 weeks, possibly 3 if we're careful." "You think we'll be trapped that long?" "I've seen storms like this before in Northumberland. They can last days, sometimes weeks. The roads won't be passable for some time, even after the snow stops." He poured coffee for her, a surprisingly domestic gesture. "I hope you won't find the confinement too oppressive." Eleanor accepted the cup, their fingers brushing briefly. Again, that strange electric sensation. "I suppose it depends on the company." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Indeed, they ate breakfast in relative comfort, discussing neutral topics, books they had read, places they had traveled before their respective circumstances had changed. The Duke was well educated and surprisingly well traveled, and Eleanor found herself engaged in actual conversation, rather than the stilted exchanges of the previous day. But beneath the civility, Eleanor sensed tension building. They were dancing around something, both aware of the elephant in the room. This was only the second day of their marriage, and certain expectations typically accompanied such unions. As if reading her thoughts, the Duke set down his coffee cup and looked at her directly. "We should discuss the arrangements for tonight." Eleanor's heart began to race. "Tonight? It is customary, I understand, for a marriage to be consummated on the wedding night. We delayed due to the journey and the late hour yesterday, but I thought we should be clear about expectations moving forward." His clinical tone should have been reassuring, but instead it made Eleanor feel like a problem to be solved, a task to be completed. She set down her own cup with more force than intended. "Is that what I am to you? An obligation to be fulfilled?" "That's not what I meant." "Then what did you mean, Your Grace?" Eleanor stood, unable to remain seated. "Should I prepare myself for your arrival in my chambers tonight? Should I lie there and think of England, or in this case America, while you perform your duty as a husband?" The Duke stood as well, frustration evident in his rigid posture. "You're twisting my words. I'm trying to be respectful, to give you warning rather than simply appearing at your door with expectations." "How thoughtful. And after you've taken what you paid for, what then? Do we return to our separate corners of this enormous house and pretend the other doesn't exist?" "That's not—" He stopped, ran a hand through his dark hair, disrupting its perfect arrangement. "I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to be what you need me to be." The raw admission stopped Eleanor's anger cold. She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not the cold Duke everyone feared, but a man who was genuinely struggling, who had no idea how to navigate the situation he had created. "Then perhaps," she said quietly, "you should stop trying to be what you think I need, and simply be honest about what you want." He stared at her for a long moment, something warring in his pale eyes. Then he moved to the door and locked it, ensuring their privacy. When he turned back to her, his expression was raw, vulnerable in a way she hadn't seen before. "The truth?" His voice was rough. "The truth is, That I'm terrified of you. Eleanor blinked. Of me? That's absurd. I'm terrified, he repeated, moving closer. Because for the first time in 5 years, I felt something last night. When you played that violin, when you spoke about your family, when you looked at Catherine's photograph with genuine sympathy rather than jealousy or calculation, I felt something crack inside me, and that terrifies me more than anything. Eleanor's breath caught. Why does feeling something scare you so much? Because the last time I allowed myself to feel, the last time I loved someone, I lost them. His hands clenched at his sides. Catherine and James were my entire world. When they died, something inside me died too. I've spent 5 years carefully constructing walls to ensure I never feel that kind of pain again. And then I what? Then you walked into my library in the middle of the night and you saw through all of it. You saw past the coldness to the grief beneath, and you didn't run. You didn't pity me. You just understood. He turned away, moving back to the windows. Do you know what your father told me when I made my offer? What? He said you were strong, that you had held your family together through their darkest hours. That you never complained, never broke down, never asked for anything for yourself. He said you had the kind of strength that most people spend their entire lives trying to cultivate. The Duke's reflection in the snow-covered window was ghostly, insubstantial, and I thought that kind of strength would be easy to keep at a distance, that you would be content with the arrangement, with the material comforts, with the security. But I'm not, Eleanor said softly. No, you're not. He turned to face her again. And that's the problem, because now I have to tell you something, and once I do, everything changes. Eleanor's heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. Tell me what? The Duke took a deep breath as if preparing for battle. I didn't choose you randomly, Eleanor. I knew your family. More specifically, I knew your brother. Eleanor felt the world tilt. Thomas? You knew Thomas? More than knew him. He saved my life. Eleanor sank back into her chair, her legs suddenly weak. Thomas had died 4 years ago in a shipping accident, or so they had been told. The family had never received much information beyond the official report. The Duke remained standing, his expression grave. It was in London 6 years ago. I was there on business, and I'd made the mistake of walking through a dangerous part of the city after dark. I was attacked, 3 men intent on robbery and worse. I would have died in that alley if your brother hadn't intervened. Thomas was in London? Eleanor's mind reeled. We thought he was in Boston. He was traveling, working odd jobs on various ships. He heard the commotion and came running. He fought them off, took a knife wound in the process. Not fatal, but serious enough. I got him to a doctor, paid for his treatment, and we spent the next 3 days talking while he recovered. The Duke moved to sit across from her again, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. He told me all about his family, about his mother who loved gardens, his father who had once been kind, his 3 sisters, especially the eldest, who he said was the strongest person he knew. He showed me a photograph he carried of you. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. I didn't know he carried a photograph of me. He carried photographs of all of you, but he talked about you the most, about how you'd practically raised your younger sisters, how you'd managed the household when your mother was ill, how you never complained even when things were difficult. The Duke's voice softened. He loved you all very much, and he made me promise something before he left London. What? That if anything ever happened to him and if his family ever needed help, I would provide it. He said the shipping business was dangerous, that he knew the risks. He wanted to ensure you would all be protected. The Duke met her eyes directly. 2 years later, I received word of his death. I immediately began looking into your family's situation, and I discovered the debts, the scandal, the deteriorating circumstances. Eleanor could barely breathe. So this arrangement was never about acquiring a wife for social purposes. It was about fulfilling a promise to a man who saved my life. He stood again, began pacing. But I couldn't simply give your father money. He would have gambled it away, and you would have been no better off. I needed a way to ensure your family's long-term security, and I needed a way to keep you close enough to protect you properly. So you bought me. Eleanor's voice was hollow. I saved you, he corrected, stopping his pacing to look at her. And yes, perhaps my methods were cold and calculating, but they were effective. Your family's debts are paid. Your sisters will have dowries. Your parents will never want for anything. And you're safe here, Eleanor. You'll never be forced to worry about money or security again. But you let me believe. Eleanor stood, anger and confusion warring inside her. You let me believe I was nothing more than a transaction to you, that you saw me as property, as an obligation, because it was easier. The Duke's voice rose, his carefully maintained control slipping. It was easier to maintain distance, to pretend this was just a business arrangement, than to admit the truth, which is that I made a promise to your brother, yes, but I also saw your photograph. And when I met you, when I saw your strength and dignity, even in the face of such a humiliating situation, when I heard your voice cutting through my coldness with honesty instead of false flattery. He stopped, seemed to struggle with the words. I realized I hadn't chosen you just to fulfill a promise. I'd chosen you because some part of me, some part I thought was dead, recognized something in you, something that terrified me. Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face now. You should have told me. From the beginning, you should have told me about Thomas, about the promise. Would you have believed me? Would you not have thought it was just another manipulation, another way to make you compliant? He moved closer, his eyes intense. I planned to tell you eventually, once you were settled, once you trusted me. But then last night in the library you looked at me with such understanding, such lack of judgment for my grief, and I realized I couldn't keep lying to you, not even by omission. What else haven't you told me? Eleanor demanded. The Duke was quiet for a moment, then he reached into his waistcoat pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper, worn soft with age. He handed it to Eleanor. She unfolded it with shaking hands and recognized Thomas's handwriting immediately. The letter was addressed to the Duke, to my friend, and it was dated 1 week before Thomas's death. My friend, if you're reading this, then the worst has happened, and I'm no longer around to look after my family. I'm writing this before my final voyage, because I have a bad feeling about this trip and I wanted to ensure my wishes were clear. Please, find a way to help them. My father's gambling has gotten worse. I've received letters from Eleanor describing their situation, though she tries to hide how bad it truly is. My mother is not well. My younger sisters are still children, and Eleanor, she deserves so much more than the life that awaits her if things continue as they are. I know you are a man of honor, despite what London society may say about you. I saw that honor when you treated my injury, when you spoke of your own lost family with such pain and love. You understand what family means. I'm asking you as my friend to find a way to protect them. I don't care how you do it. Just ensure that Eleanor, especially, is safe and cared for. She has sacrificed so much for our family. She deserves happiness, security, a future that doesn't involve worry and want. I trust you will know what to do. Your grateful friend, Thomas Hartwell. Eleanor's hands trembled as she finished reading. She looked up at the Duke through tear-blurred eyes. He knew he was going to die. The ship he was on was reportedly unseaworthy. Several crew members had refused to sail on it, but Thomas needed the money, needed it for your family. The Duke's voice was thick with emotion. He chose to risk his life for you, Eleanor, for all of you. The least I could do was honor his wishes. Eleanor sank into her chair again, overwhelmed. Everything she had believed about this arrangement, about the Duke's motivations, had been wrong. He hadn't purchased her coldly and calculatingly for his own purposes. He had been trying to save her, to protect her, to fulfill a dying man's wishes. I don't know what to say, she whispered. The Duke knelt in front of her chair, an unexpectedly humble gesture from a man who had seemed so proud and untouchable. His pale eyes, usually so cold, were warm now with barely suppressed emotion. Say you understand why I did this. Say you can forgive the deception, even if it was well-intentioned. His voice was rough, raw. Say that perhaps, given time, we might find a way to make this marriage more than just the fulfillment of a promise. Eleanor reached out tentatively, placing her hand against his cheek. He flinched at first, clearly unused to gentle touch, but then leaned into it slightly, his eyes closing briefly. You loved him, Eleanor said softly. Thomas, you truly cared about him. He was the first person in years who treated me like a human being rather than a title or a tragedy. We had only 3 days together, but he reminded me what it felt like to have a friend, to laugh, to feel normal. The Duke opened his eyes, and Eleanor was shocked to see them glistening with unshed tears. When I heard he died, I felt like I'd lost another piece of myself, fulfilling his wishes, protecting you. It's the only way I know to honor his memory. Then we honor him together, Eleanor said, her voice steady despite her tears. But no more lies, Your Grace. No more pretending to be cold when you're not. No more hiding behind walls. I don't know if I can be what you deserve, he said quietly. I don't know if I remember how to be warm, how to let someone in. Then we learned together. Eleanor used her thumb to wipe away a tear that had escaped down his cheek, the first crack in his icy facade becoming a flood. Because I don't know how to be a duchess, and you don't know how to be a husband to someone you actually care about. We're both lost in this storm, trying to find our way. The Duke's hand came up to cover hers, holding it against his face. His skin was cold, but his grip was strong, almost desperate. I'm so tired, Eleanor. I'm so tired of being alone, of carrying this grief by myself, of pretending I don't need anyone. Then stop pretending. Eleanor slid from her chair to kneel before him, bringing them eye to eye. Stop pretending and let me in. Not because you promised Thomas, not because you bought the right to call me your wife, but because we're both trapped in this storm together, and neither of us has to weather it alone. For a long moment they knelt there facing each other, the wind howling outside, and the fire crackling within. Then, slowly, the Duke leaned forward and rested his forehead against hers. The gesture was so intimate, so vulnerable, that Eleanor felt her breath catch. I don't know how to do this, he whispered. I don't know how to let someone matter to me again. You start small, Eleanor whispered back. You start by telling me your first name, because I can't keep calling you Your Grace when we're kneeling on the floor together crying. A sound escaped him, half laugh, half sob. Alexander. My name is Alexander. Alexander, Eleanor repeated, tasting the name. That's a strong name. A good name. It was my father's name, and his father's before him. Alexander pulled back slightly to look at her. Say it again, Alexander. Again, Alexander. Eleanor smiled through her tears. Why? Because no one has spoken my name with kindness in 5 years. Because hearing it from your lips makes me feel almost human again. His hand came up to cup her face, his thumb tracing her cheekbone with surprising gentleness. You're extraordinary, do you know that? You've been here 2 days, and you've already shattered every defense I spent 5 years building. Is that a bad thing? Eleanor asked. I don't know. It's terrifying, but it's also— he seemed to struggle for words. It's also the first time in 5 years I've felt anything other than numbness, so perhaps it's not entirely bad. They remained kneeling there, faces close, hands touching as the storm raged outside. Eleanor could feel the rapid beating of her heart, could see her own pulse reflected in the hollow of Alexander's throat. The tension between them had shifted from antagonistic to something else entirely, something charged and fragile and new. About tonight, Alexander said quietly. About the expectations. Eleanor felt her cheeks flush. Yes, I want you to know that I have no intention of treating you as property or as an obligation to be fulfilled. You've never been just a transaction to me. He took a shaky breath. But we are married, and at some point, if we're to build something real between us, there will need to be intimacy, trust, partnership in every sense. I know, Eleanor said softly, but not tonight. Not until you're ready. Not until this feels like a choice we're both making freely, rather than an obligation. His eyes searched hers. Can you accept that? Can you trust that I mean what I'm saying? Eleanor thought about everything she had learned today, about Thomas's sacrifice, about Alexander's promise, about the grief and loneliness that had driven him to such extreme measures. She thought about the man kneeling before her who had let her see his tears, who had spoken his name like a gift. I can trust that, she said. But Alexander, yes, I'm not as fragile as you think I am. I'm not going to break if you admit you care about me. I'm not going to run if you let me see the parts of yourself you've been hiding. She moved her hand from his face to rest over his heart, feeling it beat rapidly beneath her palm. Thomas was right about one thing. I am strong enough to handle your grief, your walls, your fears, strong enough to be a true partner to you. If you'll let me. Alexander covered her hand with his own, pressing it more firmly against his chest. You make it sound so simple. It is simple. It's just not easy. Eleanor smiled slightly. But I think we've both had enough of easy, haven't we? Easy would have been you ignoring Thomas's request. Easy would have been me accepting a life of poverty and resignation. We both chose the harder path. We might as well walk it together. Something shifted in Alexander's expression then, a softening, a surrender. He leaned forward and pressed his lips to her forehead in a kiss so gentle, so tender, that Eleanor felt tears spring to her eyes again. You undo me, he whispered against her skin, completely and utterly. Good, Eleanor replied, because you were too tightly wound anyway. This time his laugh was genuine, a real, honest sound of amusement that transformed his entire face. Eleanor saw, for just a moment, the man he must have been before grief had carved away all his softness, and she found herself hoping, desperately, that she might help him find his way back to that man. They stood together, helping each other up from the floor, like partners rather than strangers. Alexander kept hold of her hand, his thumb tracing small circles on her palm. Will you stay with me today? He asked. Simply stay. We could read, or talk, or even just sit in comfortable silence. The storm has trapped us here regardless, and I find I no longer wish to spend it alone. I'd like that, Eleanor said, but on one condition. Name it. You have to play the violin for me. You said you used to play. I want to hear what music sounds like when you create it. Alexander's expression became pained. I haven't played in 5 years. I won't be any good. I don't care about good, I care about honest. Eleanor squeezed his hand. Please? He studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. All right, but don't expect perfection. I never do, Eleanor replied with a small smile. Perfection is boring anyway. They spent the remainder of the day in the library, the same room where Eleanor had stumbled upon Alexander the night before. He built up the fire until it roared cheerfully, creating a warm cocoon against the storm's assault. They read together, sometimes aloud and sometimes in silence. They talked about everything and nothing. Childhood's favorite books, places they dreamed of seeing. And as evening approached, as the gray light outside dimmed toward darkness, Alexander finally retrieved the violin. His hands shook as he lifted it to his shoulder. Eleanor could see the war happening inside him, the desire to retreat back into his protective numbness fighting against his promise to her, to himself, to Thomas's memory. I don't remember if I can do this, he said quietly. Then we'll find out together, Eleanor replied, settling into her chair to listen. The first note was hesitant, uncertain, but then came another, and slowly, haltingly, a melody emerged. It was rough and unpracticed, yes, but it was also heartbreakingly beautiful. He played a piece Eleanor didn't recognize, something melancholy and sweet, full of longing and memory. As she watched him play, his eyes closed and his face unguarded, Eleanor felt something shift inside her chest. This man, this cold, distant duke who had purchased her like a piece of property, was revealing himself to be something entirely different. He was wounded and grieving and desperately lonely, but he was also capable of creating beauty, of keeping promises, of honoring the memory of a friend who had saved his life. When the music ended, Alexander lowered the violin with shaking hands. He opened his eyes to find Eleanor watching him with tears streaming down her face. Why are you crying? He asked, alarmed. Because that was beautiful, Eleanor said simply, and because I understand now why you stopped playing. Music like that, it requires you to feel everything, every loss, Every grief, every moment of joy that's been taken away. It must have been unbearable. Alexander set the violin aside carefully and moved to kneel before her chair again, a position that was becoming familiar between them. It was unbearable, he admitted, but playing it now with you here, it was also healing. Like I was finally able to say goodbye to them properly. Eleanor cupped his face in both hands. You don't have to say goodbye to them, Alexander. You just have to learn to live with their memory without letting it destroy you. Catherine and James wouldn't want you to spend the rest of your life alone and cold. How do you know what they would have wanted? His voice was rough. Because anyone who loved you enough to create that kind of grief in their absence would have wanted you to find happiness again, to find peace, to find— She hesitated, then pressed forward. To find someone who could help you remember how to live. Alexander's eyes searched hers, vulnerable and desperate. And you think you could be that person? I don't know, Eleanor said honestly, but I'd like the chance to try, if you'll let me. For answer, Alexander rose and pulled her to her feet, drawing her into an embrace so tight it almost hurt. Eleanor wrapped her arms around him, feeling the solidity of him, the reality of him. His heart beat against hers, rapid and strong. His breath stirred her hair, and for the first time since arriving at this cold stone manor, Eleanor felt truly warm. Thank you, Alexander whispered into her hair. Thank you for seeing past the ice. Thank you for not running. Thank you for being brave enough to trust me after everything. Thank you for keeping your promise to Thomas. Eleanor replied. Thank you for saving my family. Thank you for trusting me with your truth, even when it terrified you. They stood like that for a long time, holding each other as the storm howled and the fire crackled, and the ancient stone walls of the manor sheltered them from the chaos outside. When they finally pulled apart, the vulnerability in Alexander's face had been replaced by something else, something that looked almost like hope. Stay with me tonight, he said. Not for expectations or obligations. Just stay. I don't want to be alone anymore, and I don't think you do either. Eleanor's heart raced, but she nodded. All right, but we do this our way, Alexander. Not because society expects it, not because it's traditional, because we choose to. Because we choose to, he agreed. And as they moved through the rest of the evening, sharing dinner by the library fire, talking and laughing more easily than either had thought possible, Eleanor felt the first true stirrings of something she hadn't dared to hope for. Not love, not yet, but the possibility of it, the foundation of it, the beginning of something that might, with time and patience and continued honesty, grow into something beautiful and real. The storm might have trapped them together in this stone fortress, but Eleanor was beginning to think that perhaps it wasn't a prison after all. Perhaps it was exactly where they both needed to be, away from the expectations of the world, forced to confront each other honestly, given the space to build something genuine from the wreckage of their pasts. Alexander had been sold as a cold duke, a man without warmth or feeling, but Eleanor had discovered the truth. He wasn't cold at all. He was simply frozen by grief, waiting for someone brave enough to help him thaw. And that revelation, the understanding that beneath the ice beat the heart of a man who could love deeply, who could honor promises, who could create beauty even in the depths of despair, left Eleanor weak in the knees with a potent mixture of hope, fear, and the first stirrings of genuine affection. The wedding night they would eventually share would not be about obligation or expectation. It would be about choice, about trust, about two broken people finding a way to be whole together. But that would come later. For now, they had this: a storm-wrapped evening, a warm fire, and the beginning of honest partnership. And that, Eleanor thought, was more than enough. Eleanor woke to silence. After 3 days of relentless howling wind and the constant percussion of ice against windows, the sudden absence of sound was almost disorienting. She lay still for a moment, listening to her own breathing, to the distant crackle of a fire that must have been tended while she slept. Then she remembered where she was. She had fallen asleep in the library, curled in one of the large leather chairs near the fireplace. Alexander had covered her with a blanket at some point during the night. She had a vague memory of his gentle touch, of him tucking the fabric around her shoulders. He had insisted she take the chair while he took the other, maintaining a respectful distance despite their growing closeness. Eleanor sat up slowly, pushing her tangled hair from her face. Dawn light, real sunlight, not the gray darkness of the storm, streamed through the tall windows. She moved to look outside and gasped. The world had been transformed. Snow blanketed everything in sight, pristine and untouched, sparkling like diamonds in the early morning sun. The trees were heavy with it, their branches bowing under the weight. Icicles hung from the manor's eaves like crystal chandeliers. The sky above was a brilliant, cloudless blue, the kind of blue that only comes after a storm has purged the atmosphere of everything but clarity. It was breathtakingly beautiful. Magnificent, isn't it? Eleanor turned to find Alexander standing in the doorway, 2 cups of coffee in his hands. He looked different in the morning light, less severe somehow, his dark hair slightly disheveled, his shirt open at the collar. He had shadows under his eyes, suggesting he hadn't slept much, but his expression was softer than she had ever seen it. It's extraordinary, Eleanor breathed. I've never seen anything so beautiful. Neither have I, Alexander said, but he was looking at her rather than the view. Eleanor felt her cheeks warm. 3 days ago, she would have assumed such a comment was empty flattery or manipulation. Now she recognized it for what it was: honest observation from a man who was learning, slowly, to express what he felt. He handed her one of the coffee cups, and they stood together at the window watching the sun rise higher and paint the snow in shades of pink and gold. The roads won't be passable for at least a week, Alexander said quietly. Maybe longer. We're still quite isolated. Does that concern you? Eleanor asked. He turned to look at her, and something warm flickered in his pale blue eyes. No, not anymore. They spent the morning exploring the manor together. With the storm ended and sunlight flooding through windows that had been dark for days, the entire place felt different, less like a mausoleum and more like a home that had simply been waiting for someone to bring it back to life. Alexander showed her rooms she hadn't seen before, a conservatory filled with plants that had somehow survived the household's neglect, a music room with not just the violin but a piano and various other instruments, a portrait gallery where generations of stern-faced ancestors watched their descendants with varying degrees of approval. This was my great-grandfather, Alexander said, pausing before a particularly imposing portrait. He built this manor, imported every stone from England because he couldn't bear to leave his homeland behind entirely. He looks like you, Eleanor observed. The same sharp features, the same intense eyes, though the man in the portrait wore elaborate Victorian clothing. I'm told I have his temperament as well. Stubborn, proud, difficult to know. Alexander glanced at her. Catherine used to say I'd inherited all his worst qualities. It was the first time he'd spoken Catherine's name without pain clouding his expression. Eleanor took it as a good sign. And what did you inherit from your mother? She asked. Alexander smiled slightly, a real smile that reached his eyes. Supposedly, a love of music, and an unfortunate tendency toward brooding. The brooding I can confirm, Eleanor teased gently. The music too, but I suspect there's more to you than your ancestors' traits. Perhaps. He moved to the next portrait. A woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. This is my mother. She died when I was 12. Some sort of illness the doctors couldn't identify. I'm sorry, it was a long time ago, but I think losing her so young, it made me afraid to love anyone too deeply. And then I met Catherine, and despite all my fears, I loved her desperately. And when I lost her and James, he stopped, took a breath. It felt like confirmation that I'd been right to be afraid, that loving someone only leads to unbearable pain. Eleanor reached for his hand, threading her fingers through his. Or it means that love is worth the risk, even knowing it might hurt, because the alternative, living without ever connecting to anyone, that's not really living at all. Alexander squeezed her hand. You have a way of making complicated things sound simple. Maybe they are simple. We just make them complicated because we're afraid. They continued through the gallery, and Alexander shared stories of his family, some humorous, some tragic, all painting a picture of a lineage marked by passion and pride in equal measure. Eleanor found herself grateful for this glimpse into his history, understanding him better with each story. As they reached the end of the gallery, Alexander paused before one final portrait. It showed a younger version of himself with Catherine and baby James. Unlike the formal, stiff portraits of his ancestors, this one captured a moment of genuine warmth. Catherine was laughing at something. James was reaching for Alexander's face, and Alexander himself looked happier than Eleanor had ever seen him. I couldn't look at this for years, Alexander said quietly. I had it moved here where I wouldn't encounter it accidentally. But now, he studied the portrait with something like peace. Now I can see it and remember the joy instead of just the loss. That's because you're allowing yourself to heal, Eleanor said softly. No, it's because you're helping me heal. There's a difference. That afternoon, they ventured outside for the first time since the storm. The air was crisp and cold, their breath forming clouds in the bright sunlight. Snow crunched under their boots as they walked the grounds, and Eleanor felt a sense of freedom she hadn't experienced since arriving at the manor. The estate was vast. Acres of snow-covered gardens, frozen fountains, stone pathways now buried under drifts. In the distance, Eleanor could see the outline of stables and what appeared to be a small chapel. I had no idea the property was this extensive, she said, looking around in wonder. Most of it has been neglected since I arrived, Alexander admitted. I had no use for gardens or outdoor spaces. I preferred to stay inside, where I could control my environment and avoid feeling anything. And now? He looked at her, and Eleanor saw determination in his expression. Now I think it's time to bring this place back to life. Your mother loved gardening, didn't she? Perhaps when the weather warms, you could design new gardens. Make this place yours as much as it is mine. The offer touched Eleanor deeply. It wasn't just about gardens. It was about Alexander giving her agency, a role, a purpose, beyond simply being his wife in name. It was about creating a true partnership. I'd like that, she said. Very much. They walked in companionable silence for a while, and then Alexander led her to the small chapel she had noticed from a distance. It was a beautiful stone structure, Gothic in style, with stained glass windows that cast colored light across the snow. This is where Catherine and James are buried, Alexander said quietly. I had them moved here from England. I couldn't bear to leave them behind, even though being near them was painful. Eleanor understood what he was doing, showing her all the pieces of himself, even the most difficult ones, trusting her with his whole truth. They entered the chapel together. It was simple inside but elegant, with wooden pews and a small altar. At the far end, 2 marble markers stood side by side, engraved with names and dates. Alexander approached them slowly, and Eleanor stayed back, giving him space. She watched as he knelt in the snow before the markers, his head bowed. "I want you to meet someone," he said softly, speaking to Catherine. "Her name is Eleanor. She's helping me remember how to live again. I think you would have liked her. She's strong, like you were, brave. She doesn't let me hide behind my walls." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes at the intimacy of witnessing this moment. "I'll never forget you," Alexander continued. "Either of you. You'll always be part of me. But I'm learning that I can honor your memory without letting it destroy me. That I can love what we had without refusing to live the life I still have ahead of me." He stood, brushed snow from his knees, and turned to Eleanor. "Would you like to say something?" Eleanor moved forward to stand beside him. She looked at the names carved in marble. Catherine Ashford, beloved wife and mother. James Ashford, precious son. Lives cut short but never forgotten. "I wish I could have known you both," Eleanor said quietly. "Thank you for loving Alexander, for showing him what it means to have a family. I'll take care of him now. Not to replace you, that would be impossible, but to help him find joy again, in whatever way I can." Alexander's hand found hers, gripping tightly. They stood together before the graves in silence for several minutes, and Eleanor felt the significance of this moment. Alexander was saying goodbye, not to their memory, but to the all-consuming grief that had defined him for 5 years. He was choosing to move forward. When they finally left the chapel, Alexander seemed lighter somehow, as if a burden he'd been carrying had been partially lifted. "Thank you," he said as they walked back toward the manor, "for coming with me, for understanding." "You don't have to thank me for being your partner," Eleanor replied. "That's what we're building, isn't it? A real partnership." "Yes." He stopped walking, turning to face her fully. The sun was beginning to set now, painting the snow in shades of orange and pink. "Eleanor, I need you to understand something. This marriage, it started as an obligation, as a promise to your brother, but it's become something more. At least it has for me." Eleanor's heart began to race. "What has it become?" "A chance," he said simply. "A chance to build something real. A chance to create a life that isn't defined by loss and loneliness. A chance to discover who I can be when I'm not locked in grief." He took both her hands in his. "I can't promise you I'll be easy to live with. I can't promise I won't have difficult days. But I can promise that I'll be honest with you, that I'll treat you as an equal, and that I'll spend every day trying to be worthy of the second chance you're giving me." "Alexander, let me finish," he interrupted gently. "You asked me once what I wanted, rather than what I thought you needed. The truth is, I want to build a life with you, not the hollow existence I'd imagined when I first proposed this arrangement, but a real life, with laughter and music and gardens in the spring, with honesty and partnership." And he paused, seeming to gather courage, "and with the possibility of love when we're both ready for it." Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face, but they were tears of hope rather than sadness. "I want that too, all of it." "Then we're agreed." Alexander lifted one of her hands to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles in a gesture that managed to be both old-fashioned and deeply intimate. "We build this together, at our own pace, in our own way." "Together," Eleanor echoed. They walked back to the manor hand in hand as the sun set over the snow-covered landscape, painting everything in shades of gold and rose. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world made clean and new, and Eleanor thought that perhaps that was what she and Alexander were doing too, emerging from their respective storms into something clearer, brighter, full of possibility. That evening, they dined together in the morning room again, the informal space that had become theirs. The conversation flowed easily now, punctuated by laughter and comfortable silences. They talked about practical matters, how to restore the gardens, which rooms in the manor needed updating, whether to hire more staff or keep the household small and intimate. But they also talked about deeper things. Alexander told her about his dreams of maybe traveling again someday, of showing her the places he had loved before grief had made him retreat. Eleanor spoke of her desire to reconnect with her family once the roads cleared, to bring her sisters to visit so they could see she was safe and happy. "They can visit whenever they like," Alexander said. "This is your home now, Eleanor. Your family is always welcome here." After dinner, Alexander suggested a walk through the portrait gallery again, but this time, he led her past the family portraits to a door at the far end that Eleanor hadn't noticed before. "I want to show you something," he said, opening the door to reveal a narrow staircase. They climbed up and up, finally emerging onto the manor's highest tower. The view was spectacular. The entire estate spread out below them, the snow glowing silver in the moonlight, the forest stretching dark and endless beyond. "I used to come up here a lot," Alexander said, leaning against the stone parapet. "Especially in those first years. I felt closer to Catherine and James here somehow. Like if I climbed high enough, I might be able to reach them." "And now?" Eleanor asked, moving to stand beside him. "Now I come up here and see all the life spread out below, all the possibilities, all the tomorrows I thought I'd never want." He turned to her. "You've given me back my future, Eleanor. I didn't think I wanted one, but now I can't imagine not having it." Eleanor felt her breath catch. "Alexander, I'm not declaring love," he said quickly. "I'm not there yet, and I won't rush either of us with false declarations. But I need you to know that what I feel for you, this growing affection, this respect, this genuine desire for your happiness, it's more than I've felt for anyone since Catherine, and that terrifies me and thrills me in equal measure." "I feel the same way," Eleanor admitted. 3 days ago, I thought I was entering a prison. Now I feel like I've found something I didn't even know I was looking for. Not love yet, but the foundation of it, the possibility of it, the promise of it, Alexander added. He reached out and tucked a strand of her hair behind her ear, his cold fingers lingering against her cheek. May I kiss you? Not as an obligation or an expectation, but as a choice. Eleanor's answer was to close the distance between them herself, rising on her toes to press her lips to his. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, exploratory, both of them learning the shape and feel of each other. But then Alexander's arms came around her, pulling her closer, and the kiss deepened into something that spoke of promise and possibility, and the beginning of genuine connection. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathless. Alexander rested his forehead against hers, his hands still at her waist, holding her steady. That was, he started. Worth waiting for, Eleanor finished. And he laughed, a sound of pure joy that echoed off the tower walls. They stood together under the stars, wrapped in each other's arms, looking out over the estate that would be their home. The storm had passed, leaving them changed in its wake. They weren't the same people who had entered this manor 3 days ago. She wasn't the frightened girl who had been sold to save her family, and he wasn't the cold duke who had purchased a wife like one might acquire property. They were something new, something better. Two broken people who had found in each other the possibility of becoming whole. Come on, Alexander said finally, taking her hand. Let's go inside. We can start planning everything. The gardens, the renovations, our future. Together, Eleanor agreed, and let him lead her back down the tower stairs, back into the warmth of their home. The roads would clear eventually. The world would intrude again. They would have to face society, explain their unusual arrangement, deal with questions and judgment. But for now they had this, a manor full of light and warmth, a partnership built on honesty and mutual respect, and the promise of something beautiful growing between them. Eleanor had been sold to a cold duke at 19, but what he had done on their wedding night, or rather what he hadn't done, had changed everything. By choosing honesty over expectation, vulnerability over coldness, partnership over possession, Alexander had given her something far more valuable than security or wealth. He had given her hope, and in return, she had given him permission to feel again, to live again, to believe that his story wasn't over just because he had suffered terrible loss. Together, they would write a new story, one not defined by obligation or greed, but by choice and healing and the slow, steady growth of genuine love. The storm had ended, and their real life, the one they would build together, was only just beginning.